Despite having a lot going against it before, during, and after filming, F4 Thailand has turned out to be a critical success. Fans have overwhelmingly touted it as the best version of Hana Yori Dango, and it remained on VIU's top 5 list in Thailand even after it had finished airing. Even compared to GMMTV's wildly popular Boys Love series, F4 Thailand's numbers on GMM's YouTube channel show that it is largely loved by international audiences. But Hana Yori Dango as a story carries with it a lot of controversy. This should be expected, as it was first written 3 decades ago, and even then the author of the manga admitted to receiving many letters concerned about the bullying in the story. But Yoko Kamio had a point to the bullying and the violence, and she never really toned it down. First off, I want to say that portrayal does not equal promotion. Depiction does not equal endorsement. One of the more worrying stances I've seen about this story is that bullying should not be portrayed at all, especially in romantic dramedies. To their credit, the creators of F4 Thailand provided a content warning at the beginning of every single episode, and people who were not prepared for these things should not have been watching the show. And this video is not trying to convince anyone who has a traumatic reaction to violence. Your feelings are valid. Don't watch things that upset you. Also, I want to be transparent about the fact that I like problematic stories. I like dark stuff, and I searched for dark stuff in my romance even when I was way too young to be consuming it. But I digress. This video is not about that. Rather, it's about how the portrayal of violence and the subsequent anti-violence messaging is crucial to the myth of Hana Yori Dango. You might be asking, myth? How is this Thai drama considered a mythology? To paraphrase Joseph Campbell, in traditional mythology, symbols present themselves in societal rituals that are usually connected to some grand myth or story. Take, for instance, any of the major religions still practiced all over the world. All have distinct rituals that have their origins in some event, some story that is passed down. These rituals allow all of the people practicing the religion to experience the same insights, sentiments, and commitments. But Campbell also proposes that this can be reversed. In what he calls creative mythology, an individual may have an experience which they seek to communicate through symbols. In this video, I'll just refer to that communication as a story. And then if their initial experience had provided them a certain amount of depth, meaning, and import, then their story will have the value and force of a living myth. And individuals who experience this myth through that story will not have to go through rituals in order to understand it. They are simply affected by the myth, by the story alone. So essentially, any story can be a mythology. However, there are stories that more easily poke at the subconscious. For Campbell himself, he saw the works of Thomas Mann and James Joyce as creative mythology, for they used symbols in a way that not only spoke to the subconscious of others, but also transformed those symbols into something new, providing new meaning to what was already established in our psyches. These elements of change, transformation, transcendence, and iteration in general are very important because they speak to the 4 functions of myth. The first function is the mystical function, which communicates the transcendent, mysterious source that lies beyond the known world that is also within ourselves. This function never changes. It always is. What changes is our understanding of it. The second function is the cosmological function, which communicates what is seen and known, such as the world is round, all matter is made up of cells, and essentially anything that is learned through observing the natural world. As humans progress, they discover more about the world, and science essentially changes. So a mythology must incorporate those changes in order to communicate to individuals. The third function is the sociological function, which communicates the social order of the time. It is also always changing. This function speaks to those traditions we practice in our communities, such as quinceañeras, circumcisions, tattoos, or even confirmations, which all serve as rituals of sorts. The fourth and final function is the pedagogical function, which guides and teaches individuals through the inevitable crises of the stages of life. In creative mythology, Campbell goes further in this definition of the fourth function and states that it is related to integration of the individual in accordance with their self, their culture, the universe, and the mystical. So essentially, the fourth function of mythology is to tie together all of the 4 functions to better understand yourself and your place in the universe. Creative mythology distills these into an artwork, a performance, a story that communicates to people on a deeper level, soul to soul, psyche to psyche. I've discussed what makes myth before in the context of Star Wars, BTS, and even Hanayori Dango. And when F4 Thailand finally came around to premiering, I was excited to see which parts of the mythology of Hanayori Dango were going to remain intact. And like many people, I was not prepared to be blown away. F4 Thailand begins just like any other version of Hanayori Dango. A young girl attends an elite school that is ruled by 4 rich, handsome boys. They run a game of bullying where they issue a red card to students to be targets of the bullying. And the strategy of using fear and the worst of human behavior maintains their control. Until one day, when they issue the red card to the girl and she stands up to them, which therein causes the leader of the F4 to fall madly in love with her. None of these elements make the story unique or special, but the simple act of retelling the story is partaking in myth-making. For example, the first live-action version, which first aired in 2001, 2 years before the end of the manga, is titled Meteor Garden, a phrase that gives new meaning to the story. The original name roughly translates to boys over flowers, the flowers actually being the F4, the 4 flowers. And the female lead's name roughly translates to a weed, which is not as valuable as a flower, but is stronger and always grows back.
你没事吧？要不要喝可乐？
Throughout the story, there is also star and cosmic symbolism, where the boys are shown as stars or gods, unable to be reached by the weed. But in the end, the weed meets the stars, and the stars meet the weed. They sort of find this middle ground, and thus Meteor Garden, a place where the stars can grow and a place where the weed can meet them. This name or meaning isn't explicitly in the source material, but what it does is provide a symbolic standard for the story. The creator of Meteor Garden allowed the symbols to speak through her and doubled down on them, providing a stronger sense of what these symbols mean. When other versions were written, this phrase had to be acknowledged because the audience now associated it with the story, the original story. And this happens again and again each time it is recreated. The symbols speak differently to different creators, but also each creator is feeding off of the exaggerations offered by the previous creators.
그래서 아빠랑 같이 보러 다녔구나?
아니. 응? 한 번도 못 가봤어.
This is myth-making. The mystical function communicates through the power of the original story about growing up and the power inside us all to stand up against unfair systems and change them. The cosmological and sociological functions communicate through the acknowledgement of each story to adapt to a different time period and a different culture. Take, for instance, the use of pagers, cell phones, and now social media, or the focus on sports, cooking, or education for our heroine. These elements expose the differences between where and when these stories were set, and they all adapt in some big way. Even Meteor Garden 2018, which follows the manga the closest out of any of the adaptations, ages up the characters to college and makes the bully game into a card game, likely to get around the Chinese censors, but also because they acknowledged that this was a difficult story to tell in the modern day. And the fourth function, the one that guides us through the stages of life, is communicated through the doubling down of the story itself, the retelling of it, and which themes are pulled out again and again. Which brings me to a pretty important point. The violence is in every single adaptation. It is at the center of the source material, and F4 Thailand makes use of it in the most important way. Violence is used as a symbol of our realities living in societies that value domination, aggression, and physical sacrifice. F4 Thailand uses the school and the stadium where the bullying occurs as a medieval court, where Tom is the king and the others in F4 are his knights. The court cheers as the king makes judgments on the citizens of the kingdom. He is an unrighteous ruler that must learn to become a righteous one. He is a beast. He is a tyrant clinging to power. Goya, on the other hand, has a strong sense of justice and goodness. She is a gardener, a cultivator, a healer. She inspires the four flowers to grow, and, in return, they teach her about herself and that her power to care for others is actually more valuable than their power to dominate. In his lecture series, Campbell discusses the psychological functions of symbols and how archetypes can help us better understand ourselves. From a Jungian perspective,
when the ego becomes uncertain about its moral position, everything in the psyche begins to move. The whole moral and theoretical position is loose. And then there takes place two very important movements.
Campbell calls the first movement the knock-knock principle, which is the shadow coming up. The second movement he calls the twinkle-twinkle principle, which is that thing that challenged the person's moral position in the first place. It's new, it's exotic, it's alluring. These two things cause the ego and the shadow to collide.
You see what's happening is the social bounds, the social right-hand path system is disintegrating. Shadow comes up and you have the collision of righteous against darkness and so forth and so on. And the other, exotic allure. Then the poor man, everything he wants to do, he doesn't want to do. And so he's hanging on more tenaciously than ever to the persona system. So half his energy goes into holding on to what he expects himself to be, and the other into wishing it were something else. What has been pushed down is going to come up. And there's the tension. And always out of that comes an enlargement of consciousness, and there has to be an assimilation of the two. Knock, knock, twinkle, twinkle, transformation of consciousness.
I've talked about this before in my videos, and I'll probably never shut up about it, but this story and stories like it, where the two are enemies destined to be lovers, and one of them is deemed morally good, the other deemed morally bad, this story makes it so that the knock-knock and the twinkle-twinkle are one and the same. The shadowy figure and the intrigue of something new, something attractive that challenges your entire being. This combination allows us to learn the world beyond patriarchy and beyond violent, dominating societies. Tom begins as a very violent individual. This behavior has been learned, and it can be unlearned. But let's also flip this for a second. I mentioned earlier that one character is usually deemed morally good, the other morally bad. But in this story, Goya also enacts violence upon Tom. She has also learned violence, but as a proactive defense in this patriarchal society. When she kicks Tom, it is considered heroic, but on her journey, she also has to discover and redefine what a hero or a heroine actually is, where there is true power, not through dominating, but through loving. Maureen Murdoch, who wrote The Heroine's Journey, Woman's Quest for Wholeness, spoke with feminist writer Star Good about this very thing.
One thing that I think is interesting, for me, in some ways, the word hero is problematic, but it's hero in a certain definition of dominator, of, brandishing the sword, and this glorification of violence, and, this glorification of the individual at the expense of all sense of any kind of community or anything else like that. So I just wanted you to address that word because, and you're kind of reclaiming it in another word by saying heroine, but in a certain way, it's a tarnished word.
It is a tarnished word. I like to think of heroic qualities. And one of the heroic qualities that I see is the people who are addressing the interconnection of all species.
Yes.
Because if I address you as an it instead of as a thou, then you and I are separate. But if we are interconnected and we're connected with the earth and we're connected with the sea, then we're not going to try to dominate or have power over anything. We realize that we are the sea as well, and we are the mountains, and we are the whales that are dying right now up in Valdez. And so a heroic quality for me is interconnection and compassion and discernment and really tapping into what's truth. So what I'm trying to do is redefine hero or heroine.
And what a love story does, especially those that are enemies to lovers, is illustrate to us that unity is most powerful. Love for any form of consciousness, even someone you once swore you hated. This shows us that everyone has the potential to love and to be loved. And that might seem like an elementary idea, but most of our society does not treasure that concept. We've all been raised under patriarchy, capitalism, and white supremacy, systems that dominate and cause violence. But these stories exaggerate our realities so that we can discover true power within ourselves to overthrow those systems. There are two incredibly important moments that I think are worth ending on. First, the atonement, where Tom refuses to fight back. We've seen in the show his progression to become nonviolent. In all other iterations of the story, the female lead is threatened with physical violence. But that's not the case here. When Goya asks him why he doesn't fight back, he says,
ถ้าฉันสู้ฉันก็แพ้ดิ
And in every previous version, this meant that he would lose the female lead because she would be hurt. In this version, Tom knows he would lose his humanity. He would lose everything he had learned from Goya if he chose to let the beast out again. Of course, this is very fairy tale. It's symbolic. It's not telling us we shouldn't fight back if we were in those situations in real life. No. Tom's actions are illustrating to us that he is changed into someone who values love over violence. The second moment is when Goya is slapped by Rosalind and has a realization in that act of violence done to her. Goya chooses to wait for Rosalind to come out to meet her again so that she can tell her that she understands her now.
คุณก็รักพามมากใช่ไหมคะ
Here, Goya has finally learned the lesson that Tom taught her, that anyone can change. And if Tom could change because of Goya's inspiration in showing him her life, her family, and her values, then Rosalind might be inspired by Tom to change because she loves him. These two moments are powerful and satisfying because they are giving us an elixir, an important lesson for our own lives. If we can look beyond the portrayal of violence alone and see the greater messaging, we can be better humans, realize that love, unity, and compassion are most powerful, and find solutions that value those heroic qualities. We can redefine the hero. Thanks everyone for watching this. Please like the video if you enjoyed it. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Click the notification bell to get updates. And don't forget to comment below to let me know what F4 Thailand meant to you and how it impacted your life. Hi, Ophelia. All right, love you all. Cheers.